The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Helena Foster's back as she gripped the wooden handle of the well bucket. Her vision swimming with dark spots that warned her body had reached its limit. She had been hauling water for 3 hours straight, filling the massive trough behind the boarding house where she worked, and her arms trembled with exhaustion as she tried to lift one more bucket over the stone rim. The rope burned against her palms, slipping through fingers that no longer had the strength to hold on, and suddenly the world tilted sideways as her knees buckled beneath her. The bucket crashed back down into the well with a distant splash, and Helena felt the hard, packed earth rising up to meet her as consciousness fled like a startled bird. When she opened her eyes, she was staring up at the bluest sky she had ever seen, and a face was hovering above her own, shadowed by the brim of a worn leather hat. Strong hands supported her shoulders, keeping her from lying flat on the ground, and a voice was speaking to her, low and concerned. "Easy now, miss. You took quite a fall there. Can you hear me?" Helena blinked, trying to focus on the man's features. He had sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and his eyes were a warm brown that reminded her of coffee with cream. A day's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and there was genuine worry etched into the lines around his mouth. She realized she was leaning against his chest, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath the faded blue shirt he wore. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, and she swallowed hard, trying again. "The water. I need to finish the water." "You need to rest," the man said firmly. "How long have you been out here?" Helena tried to push herself upright, but her arms refused to cooperate. "Since noon, Mrs. Henderson needs the trough filled before evening feeding time. The horses can wait 5 minutes." The stranger shifted his grip, helping her to sit up more fully, then reached for a canteen that hung from his belt. "Here, drink this." The water was cool and sweet, and Helena drank gratefully, feeling some measure of clarity return to her thoughts. She finally looked at the man properly, taking in the dusty boots, the worn denim trousers, and the gun belt slung low on his hips. A cowboy, then, probably passing through Centralia on his way to somewhere more exciting. Washington Territory was full of them these days in the summer of 1878, men looking for work or adventure or escape from whatever life they had left behind. "Thank you," she managed, handing back the canteen. "I will be fine now. I just need a moment." The cowboy studied her for a long moment, his gaze traveling from her face to her reddened, rope-burned hands, then to the well where the bucket still hung somewhere far below. He stood in one fluid motion, moving with the easy grace of someone who spent most of his life on horseback, and walked to the well without a word. Helena watched in confusion as he grasped the rope and began hauling the bucket up, hand over hand, making it look effortless. "What are you doing?" She called out, trying once more to stand. This time she made it to her feet, though she swayed dangerously before catching herself against the side of the well house. "What does it look like?" The cowboy brought the bucket up and over the rim, water sloshing over the sides. "Where does this need to go?" "You do not have to do that. I can manage." He turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised in a gesture that clearly said he doubted that very much. "Miss, you just collapsed in the dirt. You are in no condition to be hauling water. Now, are you going to tell me where this goes, or am I going to have to guess?" There was no mockery in his tone, no condescension, just a straightforward practicality that made Helena's throat tighten unexpectedly. She was so used to fighting for everything, to proving that she could handle whatever was thrown at her, that simple kindness from a stranger felt almost overwhelming. "Around back," she said quietly. "There is a trough by the stable." The cowboy nodded and lifted both buckets, which Helena had struggled to carry one at a time. He walked toward the back of the boarding house with steady strides, and Helena followed slowly, her legs still unsteady beneath her. She watched as he poured the water into the long wooden trough, then headed back to the well without waiting for thanks or acknowledgement. For the next hour, Helena sat in the shade of the stable, sipping water from a dipper and watching the stranger work. He moved with quiet efficiency, hauling bucket after bucket without complaint, his shirt growing dark with sweat as the afternoon wore on. Other people passed by on the street, some glancing curiously at the scene, but no one stopped to question why a cowboy was doing a boarding house girl's work. That was the way of things in Centralia. People mostly kept to themselves and did not ask questions they did not need answers to. When the trough was finally full, the cowboy set down the last bucket and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. He walked over to where Helena sat and crouched down on his heels, looking at her with those steady brown eyes. "That should hold for tonight," he said. "But you need to get someone else to help you with this tomorrow. You will kill yourself trying to do it alone." "There is no one else," Helena replied, then immediately regretted the admission. She did not need this stranger's pity. "I mean, it is my job. Mrs. Henderson pays me room and board to keep the house running. She is elderly and cannot do the heavy work anymore. And she expects you to do all this yourself. She expects me to earn my keep." Helena stood carefully, relieved when her legs held steady. "I appreciate your help, truly, but I should get back to my other duties now." She started to turn away, but the cowboy's voice stopped her. "I did not catch your name." Helena hesitated, then decided there was no harm in it. He would be gone by tomorrow anyway, riding off to whatever destination called to him. "Helena Foster, Elijah Lambert." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was somehow both casual and courteous. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Foster, even under these circumstances." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Lambert. Thank you again for your assistance." This time when she walked away, he did not call after her, but Helena could feel his eyes on her back all the way to the kitchen door. She slipped inside, grateful for the relative coolness of the house, and leaned against the doorframe for a moment, catching her breath. Through the window, she could see Elijah Lambert still standing by the well, looking thoughtful. Then he turned and walked toward the main street, disappearing from view. Helena told herself she would probably never see him again, and tried to ignore the small pang of disappointment that thought brought. But she was wrong. The next morning, Helena woke before dawn as usual and began her rounds of chores. She swept the front porch, emptied the chamber pots, started breakfast in the big kitchen stove, and was heading out to check on the water situation when she nearly collided with someone on the back steps. She let out a startled gasp and stepped back, her hand flying to her chest. Elijah Lambert stood there in the early morning light, looking slightly apologetic. "Sorry, did not mean to startle you. What are you doing here?" The question came out more sharply than Helena intended, born of surprise rather than anger. "Figured I would help with the water before I head out," Elijah said simply. "Unless you have someone else lined up for the job," Helena stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You came back to haul water." "Well, I was thinking about it last night and it did not sit right with me, leaving you to collapse again today. So here I am." He glanced toward the well. "Unless you would rather I did not." Helena struggled to find words. "That is very kind of you, but surely you have somewhere to be." "You said you were heading out." Elijah shrugged. "I can spare an hour. The trail will still be there when I am done." Before Helena could formulate a response, he was already walking toward the well, and she found herself following once more, carrying the empty buckets. They worked in companionable silence, Elijah doing the heavy hauling while Helena managed the smaller tasks, checking the horses and making sure the stable was in order. The sun rose higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and Helena found herself sneaking glances at her unexpected helper. There was something about the way he moved, purposeful and unhurried, that suggested a man comfortable in his own skin. He was not showing off or trying to impress her. He was simply doing a job that needed doing. It was rare, in Helena's experience, to encounter such straightforward decency. When the trough was full again, Elijah straightened and rolled his shoulders, working out the kinks from the repetitive motion. "That should do it. You going to be all right today?" "Yes," Helena said quickly. "This was the big job, the rest I can manage. Thank you, Mr. Lambert." "I truly do not know how to repay you. No need for repayment. Sometimes folks just need a hand is all." He settled his hat more firmly on his head and nodded toward her. "You take care of yourself, Miss Foster." Helena watched him walk away again, this time truly believing she would not see him again. Cowboys were drifters by nature, always moving on to the next town, the next job, the next adventure. She went back inside to finish breakfast preparation, pushing thoughts of brown eyes and kind gestures to the back of her mind. But when evening came and she went out to check on the horses one final time before bed, she found the water trough filled again, though she had not touched it since morning. A few of the boarders kept horses in the stable, but none of them would have taken the time to haul water. They paid for those services to be handled. Helena stood staring at the full trough, wondering if she was imagining things, until she noticed something hanging from a nail on the stable wall. It was a pair of work gloves, worn but sturdy, better quality than anything Helena owned. Tucked inside one glove was a scrap of paper with a single line written in a neat, masculine hand. "For your hands. They looked like they hurt." Helena held the gloves against her chest, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her. She looked out toward the darkening street, wondering where Elijah Lambert was tonight and whether she would ever get the chance to properly thank him. She got her answer 3 days later. Helena was in the market, selecting vegetables for the week's meals, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Those carrots look a bit tired. The ones on the left are fresher." She spun around, and there was Elijah Lambert, looking slightly dusty from the road but smiling at her with genuine pleasure. "You are still here," Helena blurted out before she could stop herself. "Looks that way," Elijah agreed. "Turns out Centralia has more to offer than I initially thought. I hired on at the Blackwood Ranch, just west of town. They needed someone who knows horses, and I needed steady work for a while." "The Blackwood Ranch," Helena repeated, her mind racing. That was one of the largest spreads in the area, and if Elijah had secured work there, he would be around for at least a few months, possibly longer. "That is wonderful. Congratulations." "Thank you." Elijah glanced at her basket, then at the merchant behind the stand who was watching them with undisguised curiosity. "Can I walk you back to the boarding house? Those look heavy." Helena's first instinct was to refuse, to insist she could manage on her own as she always did. But then she looked at Elijah's open, hopeful expression and found herself nodding. "That would be nice. Thank you." They walked through the streets of Centralia together, and Helena found herself relaxing into conversation more easily than she had expected. Elijah told her about growing up on a small ranch in Montana, about losing his parents to fever when he was 16, and spending the next 8 years drifting from place to place, working where he could. He spoke matter-of-factly about hardship without self-pity, and Helena found herself sharing her own story in return. She had come to Washington Territory 2 years ago, fleeing from an arranged marriage her uncle had tried to force on her back in Missouri. The man had been 40 years her senior and known for his cruel temper, and Helena had chosen the uncertainty of the frontier over a lifetime of misery. She had found work with Mrs. Henderson through sheer luck, and had been working at the boarding house ever since, saving every spare penny toward a future she had not quite defined yet. "That took courage," Elijah said when she finished. "Running off like that with no guarantee of what you would find." "It took desperation," Helena corrected, but she smiled to soften the words. "Though I suppose desperation and courage can look similar from the outside." They reached the boarding house too soon, and Helena found herself reluctant to say goodbye. Elijah seemed to feel the same way because he lingered on the porch, his hat in his hands, looking like he wanted to say something but could not quite find the words. "Miss Foster," he finally said. "Helena, if I may be so bold, would you allow me to call on you sometime? Properly, I mean. I know I am just a hired hand and you probably have better prospects, but I would very much like to get to know you better." Helena's heart did something complicated in her chest, a mixture of joy and fear and cautious hope. She had not allowed herself to think about romance or courtship in the 2 years since she had arrived in Centralia, too focused on survival to consider anything else. But standing here with Elijah Lambert looking at her with such earnest honesty in his eyes, she found herself wanting to take the risk. "I would like that," she said softly. "Very much." The smile that broke across Elijah's face was like sunrise, bright and warming. "Sunday afternoon. I have the afternoon free. Maybe we could take a walk if the weather holds." "Sunday afternoon," Helena agreed, and felt herself smiling back with equal brightness. That Sunday was the first of many. Elijah proved to be a consistent and thoughtful suitor, showing up exactly when he said he would, treating Helena with a respect and consideration she had rarely experienced. They walked the trails around Centralia, talking about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears and silly observations about the world around them. Elijah made her laugh with stories from his ranch work, and Helena found herself opening up about her hopes for the future, dreams she had barely admitted to herself before. "I want to have something of my own someday," she confessed one afternoon as they sat by the creek that ran along the edge of town. "Not much, maybe, but a piece of land, a house, something no one can take away from me." "That is not asking for too much," Elijah said. "That is asking for what everyone deserves, security, a place to call home. What about you?" Helena turned to look at him, studying his profile in the dappled sunlight. "What do you want?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow past. "I used to think I wanted to keep moving forever, that if I stayed still too long, all the hard things I was running from would catch up with me. But lately, I have been thinking maybe what I really want is a reason to stay put, something worth building toward instead of running from." The way he looked at her when he said it made Helena's breath catch. She reached out tentatively and placed her hand over his where it rested on the grass between them. Elijah turned his hand over, threading their fingers together, and they sat like that until the sun began to set, and they had to head back to town. As summer deepened into fall, their courtship became the subject of quiet speculation among the residents of Centralia. Mrs. Henderson, who had initially been skeptical of any man courting her hard-working helper, gradually warmed to Elijah after he spent several afternoons repairing the boarding house's sagging front steps without being asked. The other boarders smiled knowingly when Elijah came by, and the local shopkeepers started asking Helena when she was going to make an honest man of the cowboy. But Helena and Elijah took their time, both of them understanding that what they were building was too important to rush. They learned each other's rhythms and quirks, the small details that made up a whole person. Helena discovered that Elijah was an early riser who liked his coffee black and strong, that he had a beautiful singing voice he only used when he thought no one was listening, and that he was unfailingly gentle with animals and children. Elijah learned that Helena had a sharp wit hidden beneath her quiet demeanor, that she read every book she could get her hands on, and that she had nightmares sometimes about the life she had left behind in Missouri. It was after one of those nightmares, on a crisp October evening, that everything changed between them. Helena had been helping serve dinner at the boarding house when one of the new guests, a merchant from back east, had made a comment about arranged marriages being the sensible way to handle women who had too many ideas about independence. The words had hit Helena like a physical blow, dragging her back to the worst moments of her past, and she had excused herself quickly, rushing outside before anyone could see the tears threatening to spill over. She was standing behind the stable, trying to compose herself, when Elijah found her. He had been invited to dinner as he often was these days, and he had noticed her abrupt departure. He did not say anything at first, just stood beside her in the gathering darkness, a solid and comforting presence. He did not mean anything by it, Helena finally said, her voice rough. He was just making conversation. That does not make it hurt less, Elijah replied quietly. Do you want to talk about it? And so Helena told him everything, all the details she had glossed over in previous conversations. She told him about her uncle's gambling debts and how he had tried to sell her off like a piece of property to settle them. She told him about the man who had looked at her with cold, possessive eyes and talked about breaking her spirit like he would a difficult horse. She told him about stealing money from her uncle's desk in the middle of the night and running for the train station, convinced every moment that she would be caught and dragged back. When she finished, she was crying in earnest, and Elijah pulled her into his arms, holding her while she shook with the force of old terror and new relief at finally sharing the full truth. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell her it was all in the past. He just held her, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring wordless comfort until the storm passed. "You are the bravest person I have ever met," Elijah said when Helena finally pulled back, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "You know that. You took your life into your own hands and made something better for yourself. That takes more courage than anything I have ever done." "I do not feel brave," Helena admitted. "Most days I just feel like I am barely holding on." "Bravery is not the absence of fear," Elijah said, tipping her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "It is being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. You have been doing that every day since you ran. That is the definition of courage." Helena looked at him, at this man who had come into her life hauling water buckets and stayed to become so much more, and felt something shift and settle in her chest. "I love you," she said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "I did not plan to, but I do." Elijah's eyes widened, and then he was smiling, that sunrise smile that made her heart race. "I love you too," he said. "I have been trying to find the right moment to tell you for weeks now. I love you, Helena Foster, and I want to build that future with you if you will have me." "Yes," Helena whispered. And then Elijah was kissing her, tender and careful, like she was something precious. Helena kissed him back, pouring all her hope and love and trust into that kiss, and felt the last of her walls crumbling away. When they returned to the boarding house hand in hand, Mrs. Henderson took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. "About time," she said, and went back to serving dessert. Elijah proposed officially in November, on a Sunday afternoon walk that had become their tradition. He did not have a ring yet, but he had a plan laid out, careful and thorough in the way that was so essentially him. He had been saving his wages and had enough now for a down payment on a small piece of land north of town. It would need work, The house was barely more than a cabin and the land would need clearing, but it was theirs if they wanted it. He wanted to marry her properly, he said, and build her the home she dreamed of, something that belonged to them and no one else. Helena said yes before he even finished asking, and they stood there in the middle of the trail, laughing and kissing until an old farmer drove past on his wagon and yelled congratulations at them. They married in December, in the small church on Main Street with Mrs. Henderson and a few of the ranch hands from Blackwoods standing as witnesses. Helena wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Elijah wore his best clothes with a new string tie that he kept adjusting nervously. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Helena felt a joy so complete it was almost frightening in its intensity. They spent their first night as a married couple in a room at the boarding house that Mrs. Henderson had decorated with wildflowers and candles, her wedding gift to them. Elijah was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure Helena felt safe and cherished. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, talking quietly about their plans and dreams until sleep finally claimed them. The next morning, they loaded their few possessions into a borrowed wagon and headed north to their new property. The November rains had started, and the road was muddy and difficult, but neither of them cared. When they reached the cabin, small and weathered but structurally sound, Helena felt tears prick her eyes again. "It is perfect," she said, and meant it. They spent the winter making the cabin into a home. Elijah continued working at the Blackwood Ranch while Helena took in mending and laundry from town, both of them saving toward improvements in livestock. They worked side by side whenever Elijah was home, repairing the roof, chinking gaps in the walls, building furniture from salvaged wood. It was hard work, often exhausting, but they were building something together, and that made all the difference. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Helena reading aloud from whatever book she had borrowed from town while Elijah whittled or mended tack. They talked about everything, their conversations ranging from the profound to the mundane, and Helena marveled at how comfortable silence could be when you were with the right person. Some nights, Elijah would pull out his harmonica and play, and Helena would sing along, their voices blending in the warm firelight. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came new beginnings. Helena discovered she was pregnant in March, and the joy on Elijah's face when she told him was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He became even more protective, insisting on doing all the heavy work, despite Helena's protests that she was perfectly capable of normal activities. "I know you are capable," Elijah said, pulling her close, "but you are carrying something precious now. Let me take care of you both." Helena softened at his words and allowed herself to accept his help, learning that accepting care from someone who loved you was not weakness but trust. As her belly grew round with their child, Elijah would talk to it every night, telling stories and singing songs, his big hand spread warm against her skin. Helena would laugh at his earnest one-sided conversations, and sometimes the baby would kick as if responding, which delighted Elijah to no end. They planted a garden that spring, vegetables and herbs and flowers that Helena had always wanted. Elijah built a chicken coop and brought home 6 laying hens, and Helena delighted in collecting eggs each morning. They bought a milk cow from a neighboring farm, a gentle creature named Bessie who provided them with fresh milk and butter. Little by little, their homestead was coming to life, becoming the self-sufficient haven they had dreamed of. In June, Mrs. Henderson came to visit, bringing supplies and gossip from town. She stayed for 3 days, helping Helena put up preserves and giving advice about childbirth and infant care. When she left, she hugged Helena tightly and whispered that she was proud of her, and Helena felt grateful once again for the kindness that had brought her to Centralia in the first place. The baby came in September, a week earlier than expected, and in the middle of a thunderstorm. Elijah rode through the rain to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Porter, who had delivered half the babies in the county. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Helena thought she could not go on. But Elijah stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement even when she cursed at him through the pain. When their son finally arrived, wailing and red-faced and perfect, Helena wept with relief and joy. Elijah cut the cord with shaking hands, and then he was holding their baby with such tender care that Helena fell in love with him all over again. They named him Samuel, after Elijah's father, and he became the center of their world. Elijah proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle, walking the floor with Samuel when he cried at night so Helena could rest. Helena nursed their son and watched her husband cradle their child, and felt a contentment she had never imagined possible. Life settled into a new rhythm, shaped around Samuel's needs and the demands of the homestead. Elijah had saved enough to buy 2 horses of their own, and he started a small breeding operation in addition to his work at the ranch. Helena's mending business grew as word spread about the quality of her work, and she took on more complex projects, even making clothes from scratch for some of the wealthier families in the area. The years passed in a blur of work and love and small triumphs. Samuel grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's brown eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. They expanded the cabin, adding 2 more rooms and a proper front porch where Helena could sit and sew in the afternoons. The garden flourished, providing them with fresh produce through the warm months and preserved goods to see them through winter. When Samuel was 3, Helena became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and their daughter was born on a bright April morning with none of the drama that had accompanied Samuel's arrival. They named her Rose, and she was a quieter baby than her brother had been, content to watch the world with solemn gray eyes that reminded Elijah of his mother. The homestead continued to prosper. Elijah's horse breeding was earning a reputation for quality, and he was able to leave his position at the Blackwood Ranch to work their own land full-time. They hired a young man from town to help with the heavy work during busy seasons, and Helena took on an apprentice for her sewing, a girl from a struggling family who showed real talent with a needle. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the work was done, Elijah and Helena would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over their land. Elijah would take her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after so many years together, and Helena would lean against his shoulder, marveling at how far they had come from that day by the well. You ever think about what would have happened if you had just kept riding that day? Helena asked one evening, voicing a thought that had occurred to her occasionally over the years. If you had not stopped to help, Elijah was quiet for a moment, considering. I think about it sometimes, he admitted. But honestly, I do not think I could have kept riding. When I saw you collapse there, something in me just knew I had to stop. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was just decency, but I am grateful every day that I did. So am I, Helena said softly. You saved me that day in more ways than one. We saved each other, Elijah corrected, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I was just drifting before I met you, running from nothing toward nothing. You gave me a reason to stop, to build something that mattered. Helena turned to look at him, studying the face that had become dearer to her than her own. There were lines around his eyes now that had not been there when they met, a few silver threads in his dark hair, but he was still the same man who had carried water buckets for a stranger and stayed to become her whole world. "I love you," she said, as she had said countless times before and would say countless times again. "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." "I love you too," Elijah replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Always have, always will." They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, and Helena felt a peace that went bone deep. She thought about the girl she had been, terrified and alone and running from a nightmare, and the woman she had become, secure in the love of a good man and the family they had built together. The journey between those two versions of herself had been neither easy nor straightforward, but it had been worth every difficult step. As the years continued to pass, their children grew strong and capable. Samuel inherited his father's way with horses and his mother's determination, and he started helping with the breeding operation as soon as he was old enough to handle the animals safely. Rose showed an early talent for growing things, taking over more and more of the garden work and experimenting with new crops and techniques. Helena and Elijah watched their children develop into their own people with pride and amazement, grateful for every moment they had together. When Samuel was 12 and Rose was 9, Helena's uncle died back in Missouri. A lawyer's letter arrived informing her that she had inherited a small sum of money, her grandmother's portion that her uncle had been holding in trust. It was not a fortune, but it was more money than Helena had ever possessed at one time. She and Elijah discussed what to do with it for several evenings before deciding to use it to expand their breeding operation and to set aside a portion for each of the children's futures. The arrival of the inheritance also brought closure to a chapter of Helena's past that had never quite felt finished. She wrote to the lawyer, asking about the man her uncle had tried to force her to marry, and learned that he had died several years earlier, alone and unmourned. Helena felt no satisfaction in the news, just a quiet relief that she would never have to look over her shoulder again. "It is truly over," she told Elijah that night as they prepared for bed. "That whole part of my life. I am free of it completely now." "You have been free of it for a long time," Elijah said, pulling her close. "But I am glad you have the official closure. You deserve that peace." Helena rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Do you ever regret it, settling down so young? You were only 24 when we married. You could have had more adventures, seen more of the world." "I have had adventures," Elijah said. "Maybe not the kind that involve gunfights and cattle drives across half the country, but the kind that matter. Watching my children take their first steps. Building a home with my own hands. Waking up next to you every morning. Those are the adventures I wanted, even if I did not know it at the time. I have never regretted a single moment with you." Helena tightened her arms around him, blinking back tears. Even after all these years, he could still make her feel cherished and valued in a way that touched her soul. She thought about the girl who had collapsed by the well, exhausted and alone, and silently thanked her for being brave enough to accept help when it was offered. That single moment of vulnerability had opened the door to a lifetime of love. The homestead continued to thrive as the children grew older. Samuel proved to have an excellent eye for bloodlines, and their horses became sought after throughout the territory. Rose expanded the garden into a true market garden, selling produce and seeds to families throughout the county. When she was 15, she wrote away for information about new agricultural techniques being developed back east, and she implemented several innovations that increased their yields substantially. Elijah and Helena worked side by side through it all, partners in every sense of the word. They weathered hard winters and dry summers, years when money was tight and years when it was more plentiful. They nursed each other through illnesses and celebrated triumphs together. They argued sometimes, as any couple does, but they had learned early in their marriage how to fight fair and forgive quickly. Their love was not the wild, passionate thing of dime novels, but something steadier and deeper, a bedrock foundation that everything else in their lives was built upon. When Helena was 42, she discovered she was pregnant again, much to her surprise and Elijah's delight. Their friends and neighbors joked about them being old to be having babies, but the pregnancy was straightforward, and their second son was born healthy and strong just after Helena's 43rd birthday. They named him Daniel, and his arrival brought a new energy to the household. Samuel and Rose, now 20 and 17 respectively, doted on their baby brother, and the age gap meant that Daniel grew up with multiple caregivers who adored him. As their children reached adulthood and began making their own paths in the world, Elijah and Helena found themselves entering a new phase of life. Samuel married at 22, bringing home a sweet-natured girl named Clara from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on the far end of the property. Rose married at 19, a young man named Thomas who worked at the telegraph office and shared her passion for innovation and progress. They moved to Seattle, where Thomas had been offered a better position, but they visited regularly and wrote long letters about city life. Daniel grew up surrounded by horses and books in equal measure, developing into a thoughtful child who asked endless questions about everything. He had his mother's love of learning and his father's gentle way with animals, and Helena and Elijah delighted in watching him explore the world with curious eyes. Through it all, the bond between Helena and Elijah only grew stronger. They were in their late 40s now, their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work, but they moved together with the ease of people who knew each other's rhythms perfectly. Elijah still reached for Helena's hand when they walked, and Helena still leaned into his embrace at the end of long days. They had built the life they dreamed of that day by the well, and then built even more beyond it. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching Daniel play with the barn cats in the fading light, Helena squeezed Elijah's hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. Elijah turned to look at her, eyebrows raised. "For what?" "For stopping that day. For carrying the water buckets, for staying. For all of it." Helena gestured broadly at the homestead around them, at their son playing in the yard, at the life they had created. "For giving me this, Helena." Elijah's voice was thick with emotion. "You gave me just as much, more even. Before I met you, I was nobody going nowhere. You gave me purpose, family, home, everything worth having." "We gave it to each other," Helena said, echoing words he had spoken years ago. "We built this together." "Together," Elijah agreed and kissed her as the sun set over their land, painting everything gold and rose. The years continued their steady march forward. Samuel and Clara had children of their own, 3 lively grandchildren who visited often and filled the house with noise and laughter. Rose and Thomas had twin daughters who Helena got to meet when they came west for a summer visit, bright-eyed girls who reminded her of Rose at that age. Daniel grew tall and serious, eventually deciding to study animal husbandry formally, traveling to Oregon for schooling with his parents' blessing and support. Elijah and Helena became elders of their community, the older couple that young families came to for advice or help. They had survived and thrived in a hard land, and their success was an inspiration to others trying to build lives on the frontier. Helena taught sewing to young women and passed on her knowledge of running a household efficiently. Elijah mentored young men in horse breeding and training, sharing the expertise he had developed over decades. They gave back to the community that had supported them and took quiet pride in seeing others succeed. In their mid-50s, they made the decision to gradually scale back their work, turning more of the daily operations over to Samuel and Clara. It was not retirement exactly. They were both too active and engaged to stop working entirely, but they gave themselves permission to work at a slower pace and to take more time for themselves. They took day trips to explore parts of Washington they had never seen, packed picnics, and rode out to remote valleys and hidden lakes. They spent long afternoons reading together or simply sitting in companionable silence, enjoying the peace they had earned. Mrs. Henderson passed away when Helena was 56, dying peacefully in her sleep at the impressive age of 92. Helena wept at the funeral, remembering the elderly woman who had given a desperate runaway a chance and become like family over the years. In her will, Mrs. Henderson left Helena a set of china that had belonged to her mother, and a letter expressing how proud she was of the life Helena had built. Helena treasured both the dishes and the letter, displaying the former in her china cabinet and keeping the latter in her jewelry box where she could reread it whenever she needed the reminder. When Daniel finished his schooling, he returned to the homestead with new ideas and techniques for horse breeding. He worked alongside his parents and brother, bringing innovation to their established practices, and the family operation reached new heights of success. Helena watched her youngest work with his father, the two of them so similar in their patient, methodical approach to the animals, and felt grateful that Daniel had found his calling so clearly. As Elijah and Helena moved into their 60s, their health remained remarkably good. They had worked hard their entire lives, but they had also eaten well, gotten plenty of fresh air and exercise, and had the benefit of loving support from family and community. They were both gray-haired now, their faces lined with age and laughter, but they were still capable and active. Elijah's hands were gnarled from decades of manual labor, but they were still strong enough to handle the horses. Helena's eyes needed spectacles for close work, but her mind remained sharp and her sewing hand steady. They became great-grandparents when Samuel's oldest daughter had a son, a squalling infant who looked like every baby and no baby all at once. Helena held her great-grandson and marveled at the passage of time, at how the frightened girl by the well had become a matriarch of a thriving family. She looked at Elijah, who was watching her with their great-grandson with soft eyes, and smiled. "We did all right," she said, and he laughed. "We did better than all right. We did magnificently." On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party at the homestead. Friends and neighbors came from miles around to celebrate the couple who had become an institution in the community. There was food and music and dancing, and story after story shared about Helena and Elijah's kindness and generosity over the years. Helena was overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection, and she clung to Elijah's hand throughout the evening, grateful for every person who had touched their lives. When the party finally wound down and the last guests had departed, Helena and Elijah found themselves alone on their porch once more, the same place they had shared so many quiet moments over the decades. The house was silent behind them, their children and grandchildren having returned to their own homes, and the night was peaceful around them. 40 years, Helena said wonderingly. "How did that happen?" "One day at a time," Elijah replied. "One choice at a time to keep choosing each other." "I would make the same choices again," Helena said. "Every single one, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. They led me here to you, to this life. I would not change any of it." Elijah raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "You have made me the happiest man alive, Helena Lambert. Every day for 40 years, you have been my greatest blessing." Helena felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were happy tears, the kind that came from a heart too full to contain all the joy inside it. She leaned against Elijah, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they sat together watching the stars wheel overhead in the vast western sky. They had many more years together, years filled with the ordinary magic of a life well lived. They watched their grandchildren grow, and their great-grandchildren be born. They celebrated successes and mourned losses, held fast through storms both literal and metaphorical. They grew old together with grace and gratitude, never taking for granted the gift they had been given that day by the well. When Elijah died at 78, peaceful in his sleep beside the wife he had loved for over 50 years, Helena grieved deeply, but without regret. They had had a full life together, had loved each other completely, and raised a family that would carry on their legacy. She missed him terribly. The loss was like losing part of herself, but she was grateful for every moment they had shared. Helena lived several more years, surrounded by family who loved her and cherished her stories about the old days. She told her grandchildren and great-grandchildren about coming west as a young woman, about collapsing by a well and being rescued by a cowboy with kind eyes. She told them about falling in love slowly and surely, about building a home and a family against all odds. She told them that the secret to a good life was simple. Find someone who sees you truly, who values you completely, and choose them every day with your whole heart. When Helena passed away at 85, holding the hand of her youngest son Daniel, she died with a smile on her face. Her last words were Elijah's name, spoken with love and anticipation, and those who were there said she looked peaceful, as if she were going to meet someone she had missed very much. They buried her next to Elijah on a hill overlooking the homestead they had built together, under a sky as blue and vast as the one that had witnessed their first meeting. The gravestone was simple, bearing both their names and a single line that Samuel had chosen, "Together always." The homestead continued for generations, passed down through the family Helena and Elijah had started. The original cabin was preserved and maintained, a testament to humble beginnings and the power of hard work and love. Children grew up hearing stories about their ancestors, about the woman who ran away to build a better life and the man who stopped to carry water buckets and stayed to build a legacy. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light slanted gold across the land, people swore they could see two figures on the old porch, sitting close together and holding hands, watching over the home they had created and the family they had loved. Whether it was memory or magic or simply the power of a love that transcended even death, no one could say for certain. But the sight always brought comfort, a reminder that some bonds were too strong to be broken, even by time itself. The well still stood, too, maintained and functional after more than a century. It had been preserved as a landmark, the place where Helena Foster and Elijah Lambert's story had begun. Young couples would sometimes visit it, tossing coins into the water and making wishes for love as true and lasting as the one that had started there all those years ago. And if sometimes those wishes seemed to come true more often than random chance could account for, well, that was just another part of the legend, because that was what they had become, eventually. A legend, a story passed down and embellished and held up as an example of what love could be when it was built on respect, partnership, and unwavering commitment. The specific details might blur with time, but the essential truth remained. Two people had found each other in the hardest of circumstances, had chosen to build a life together, and had created something beautiful that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. In the end, that was all anyone could really ask for, to love and be loved, to build something meaningful, to leave the world a little better than they found it. Helena and Elijah had done all that and more, and their story lived on, inspiring others to have the courage to collapse by their own metaphorical wells, to accept help when it was offered, and to recognize love when it came carrying water buckets and wearing a worn leather hat. Their story was the Wild West at its best, not the violence and lawlessness that filled dime novels, but the quiet heroism of ordinary people building extraordinary lives through determination, hard work, and love. It was a reminder that the frontier was not just a place but a state of mind, a willingness to venture into unknown territory and create something new. Helena and Elijah had been pioneers not just of land but of the heart, mapping out a life together, one choice, one day, one carried bucket at a time. And so their love story endured, passed down through generations, adapted and retold, but always maintaining its essential truth. Somewhere in the heart of Washington, on a thriving homestead overlooking rolling hills, the legacy of that first act of kindness by a well continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways both large and small, a testament to the transformative power of compassion, courage, and love. The end.